is a comic book. For the better part of 90 years, comic books have been a staple of American pop culture. But in the 1950s, the United States freaked out big time over comic books. There were Senate hearings and comic book burnings. In the end, careers were ruined, companies went out of business, and comics fell under a strict censorship regime for decades. At the center of all this were two very different men, EC Comics publisher Bill Gaines and psychologist Frederick Wortham. But first, let's take a step back and take a look at how comic books got their start. They began as comic strips in newspapers. Then someone got the idea to package comic strips together, and the comic book was born. The medium exploded onto the market in the 1930s.
Comics are sort of the classic overnight success. Once Superman started, the industry just grew exponentially in terms of titles and publishers and sales.
Comics were cheap and widely available at newsstands and drugstores.
Especially with children, this was the first time that they could really pick their own reading material. If you wanted to have a children's book, or you wanted to listen to the radio or go to the movies, that was something that you cleared with your parents. Comic books were readily available. They were easily traded back and forth.
So just how popular were comics? In the mid-1940s, comic books were selling at a rate of between 80 and 100 million copies every week. Think about that for a second. The US population in 1940 was around 132 million. Comics reached more people than movies, radio, and at the time, television.
They were as common as oxygen. That's how huge comics were in the 40s, even after the war, especially after the war.
Superman helped usher in the golden age of superheroes, but a very real war between superpowers was on the horizon.
Directly after World War II, the superhero really falls out of favor. I think people were sick of fighting.
Publishers really needed new genres now that superheroes weren't popular anymore, and they wanted to capture older comic readers. They turned to what was also selling on bookshelves: romance and pulpy crime stories. Kids loved them. Church groups and police hated them. They thought the flood of violence and sex in comics were corrupting the youth.
Comics reading created a sphere for kids that was for them, and had very little adult supervision, and that freaked a lot of people out.
Some were actually really violent, and the backlash against them turned into front-page news. Cities and states began trying to pass laws banning crime comics, and a handful of anti-comic groups even organized mass comic book burnings in the late 1940s. The comic business was still booming, though, and by the 1950s, one publisher came up with the next big genre: horror. EC Comics publisher Bill Gaines began legendary comic lines like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. His artists and writers pushed the limits on gore and shock value. They also tried to cultivate an anti-authority tone and produce twist endings that skewered America's cookie-cutter post-war culture. Then came psychologist Frederick Wortham. He thought comics were a big factor behind juvenile delinquency, and he wanted to ban selling them to children altogether. Basically, he thought comics were tempting children to acts of violence and crime. And some important people agreed with him. His book, Seduction of the Innocent, became a bestseller after its release in 1954. At the same time, the Senate was taking juvenile delinquency so seriously, it created a subcommittee dedicated solely to the issue. The senators decided comic books would be their first target. Hearings started in the spring of 1954. Frederick Wortham testifies on the first day.
It were my task, Mr. Chairman, to teach children delinquency, to tell them how to rape and seduce girls, how to hurt people, how to break into stores, how to cheat, how to forge, how to do any known crime. If it were my task to teach that, I would have to invent the crime comic book industry.
Gaines testified right after Wortham.
I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wortham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid.
It didn't go well for Gaines after that.
I've just been looking over some of these. Here seems to be your May 22nd issue, and here seems to be a man with a bloody axe holding a woman's head up, which has been severed from her body. think that's in good taste?
Yes, sir, I do. For the cover of a horror comic. A cover in bad taste, for example, might be defined as holding the head a little higher so that the neck could be seen dripping from it, and moving the body over a little further so that the neck of the body could be seen to be bloody.
Well, you've got blood coming out of her mouth, you see.
A little.
Then here's blood on the axe, the hatchet. And I think most adults are shocked by that.
Gaines's testimony was the nail in the coffin when it came to public sentiment against comic books. The comic book industry almost immediately gave in and created what would become the Comics Code Authority. How strict was the code? Imagine if every video game today with blood, sexual innuendo, or anti-authority leanings were removed from store shelves.
Not only did we get rid of the most egregious of the comics, we got rid of almost everything that had any kind of content that wasn't absolutely G-rated bland stuff.
The code also scrubbed any mention of race and gender issues. The outright ban on horror and crime comics forced Gaines out of the comic book industry. He turned his focus onto a new magazine, which didn't fall under the Comics Code Authority. The hearings, the code, and other factors like the rise of television, for one, decimated the comic book industry. Half of the comics on newsstands disappeared between 1954 and 1956.
The button to the joke is that the Senate came back and in their report cleared comics. They said comics are not, in fact, a major contributing factor to juvenile delinquency. And yeah, sure, they're a little bloody at times and maybe a little too sexy here and there, but for the most part, we don't agree with Wortham's findings. We don't see a big connection here. And so really, the industry just did it to themselves, out of fear that if they didn't do it, the government would do it for them.
The code lasted for decades. It changed a few times as comics changed with the times. The industry abandoned it altogether by 2011. But the cultural damage to comic books was long-lasting.
I think, one of the things that the Comics Code did is that they reclassified comics as juvenile literature. Comic books are for kids. And the minute you sort of take something and you say, this is juvenile, this is only for kids, you get rid of a whole audience.
The fight over comics would repeat itself with calls to clean up television, video games, and now the internet.
Hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
Comic books as a medium fell victim to the moral panic of the 1950s, but its stories are now fodder for blockbuster films that bring in billions. And what happened to Gaines? He probably had the last laugh. That magazine he started, it was Mad Magazine.